And as the decades moved quietly forward, something subtle began to shift beneath the still surface of American life. It did not happen all at once. There was no single morning when a farmer woke up and declared, "The world is changing." Instead, change arrived in sounds. First, the distant echo of a hammer striking iron, then the unfamiliar whistle of steam. By the 1830s and 1840s, thin ribbons of railroad track began stretching across parts of the eastern United States. At first, they connected only major towns. Many rural Americans had never seen a train. Some had never even heard one. But those who did often described the experience with awe. A machine made of iron and fire, pulling carriages faster than any horse could gallop. To a person who had never traveled more than 10 miles from home, the train must have seemed almost supernatural. And yet, even as railroads expanded, they did not immediately transform daily life for most Americans. Tracks were expensive to build. Investors focused on profitable routes, connecting cities and ports and industrial centers. Vast rural stretches remained untouched. If you lived in a small farming community 20 miles from the nearest rail line, the train may as well have been a rumor. Still, momentum was building. By 1850, the United States had over 9,000 miles of railroad track. By 1860, that number had tripled. Now, distance began to shrink in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. A journey that once required days in a jolting stagecoach could now be completed before sunset. For the first time, ordinary Americans began to think beyond their immediate surroundings. But not all travel was voluntary. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. Word spread slowly at first, a whisper traveling eastward by letter and newspaper. Then it grew louder. Gold in the rivers of California. By 1849, thousands of Americans, farmers, clerks, carpenters, abandoned their homes to chase fortune. They became known as the 49ers. Many had never traveled beyond their county lines before. Now they faced journeys of thousands of miles. Some traveled by wagon across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. The trip could take 6 months or more. Disease, starvation, accidents, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Others sailed around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a dangerous ocean voyage that could last 5 months. For these travelers, the 10-mile boundary dissolved overnight. But for every man who left for California, hundreds remained behind. Wives stayed to manage farms. Children continued planting and harvesting. Churches still held Sunday services. Blacksmiths still hammered horseshoes. The gold rush was dramatic, but it did not instantly erase the rootedness of American life. Then came something that would force mobility on an unprecedented scale: the Civil War. When war broke out in 1861, millions of men left their hometowns to join the Union or Confederate armies. For many, it was the first time they had ever crossed state lines. A farm boy from Indiana might find himself marching through Tennessee. A young man from Georgia might camp in Virginia. Letters home describe astonishment, new landscapes, new accents, new foods. Some soldiers wrote about seeing mountains for the first time. Others described vast cities with paved streets and gas lamps. War was devastating, but it also exposed Americans to a wider nation. And when soldiers returned home, they brought stories. They had seen beyond 10 miles. They had glimpsed the breadth of the country. After the war, railroads expanded even faster. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 symbolically connected East and West. A journey from New York to California that once took months could now be completed in about a week. 7 days. What had once been unimaginable was now possible. Towns sprang up along rail lines. Businesses flourished near stations. Travel became slightly more accessible to the middle class. But still, even in 1870, most Americans did not travel for pleasure. Vacations were rare. Tourism existed mainly for the wealthy. For working families, travel remained tied to necessity, work, migration, or family matters. The Industrial Revolution accelerated change. Factories in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York demanded labor. Rural Americans began moving toward urban centers in greater numbers. Immigrants arriving from Europe flooded into port cities. Gradually, the idea of relocation became more common. Yet it is important to remember that this transformation took decades. If you were born in 1800 and lived until 1875, you would have witnessed astonishing change, from horse-drawn wagons to steam locomotives crossing continents. But if you were born in 1820 and died in 1850, your life may still have unfolded entirely within a small geographic circle. Mobility was not evenly distributed. Wealth mattered. Race mattered. Enslaved African Americans in the South were brutally restricted in their movement. Travel required permission. Families were often separated and sold across state lines against their will. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved individuals traveled in search of lost family members, sometimes walking hundreds of miles, guided only by word of mouth. For them, travel was not adventure. It was reunion, survival, freedom. Meanwhile, Native American tribes were forcibly displaced across vast distances through government policies such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Trail of Tears forced thousands of Cherokee people westward under brutal conditions. Many died along the way. Mobility in 19th century America was deeply unequal. Some could not leave, others were forced to, and many simply stayed because life demanded it. As the 19th century neared its end, bicycles appeared. Affordable and revolutionary, they allowed individuals, especially young people, to travel farther under their own power than ever before. Then, in the early 20th century, automobiles emerged. Suddenly, the 10-mile boundary truly began to fade. Roads improved, gas stations appeared, highways stretched across states. By the 1920s, Americans were taking road trips. A family could leave their hometown for the weekend. That idea would have seemed almost impossible a century earlier. But to understand why most people in the 1800s America never traveled more than 10 miles from home, we must step back into their mindset. Travel was not freedom. Stability was freedom. Land, family, church, and community were anchors in a world without safety nets. There was no social security, no insurance, no reliable medical system. Leaving meant vulnerability. Staying meant security. If you close your eyes again and imagine that farmhouse in 1820, the wooden floorboards, the iron stove, the oil lamp glowing softly at night, you might begin to understand. Beyond the fields lay uncertainty. Within them lay everything familiar. And for most people, that was enough. The world did not feel small. It felt complete.
As the 19th century slipped quietly into memory, something curious happened. Even as Americans began traveling farther, faster, and more often, a strange nostalgia emerged, an unspoken longing for the rooted lives their grandparents once lived. Because for all the hardship of staying close to home, those lives had a kind of completeness that later generations would struggle to recover. In 1800, time itself moved differently. Days were measured not by clocks, but by light. Morning began when the sky softened from black to blue. Evening ended when the oil ran low. Seasons mattered more than dates. A late frost or early drought could shape an entire year. And because survival depended on rhythm, people learned patience. Travel disrupted that rhythm. Leaving home meant breaking the invisible agreement between land and labor. Crops did not wait. Animals needed tending. Fences collapsed if ignored. Wells dried if not maintained. The land remembered neglect. That is why journeys, when they happened, were planned with near religious seriousness. A 10-mile trip required preparation, food packed, tools gathered, neighbors informed. Someone had to watch the children, someone had to feed the animals. Distance was not just physical, it was responsibility multiplied. Letters from the era reveal this mindset clearly. A man traveling 15 miles to attend court might apologize profusely to his family for the burden his absence caused. A woman visiting her sister 2 towns away would describe the journey as long and trying, even if it took only a day. Words mattered. Far did not mean miles. It meant risk. And yet, within these small worlds, people experienced lives of immense emotional depth. They fell in love, raised children, buried parents, argued with neighbors, laughed at church picnics, mourned failed harvests, and celebrated good ones. Drama did not require distance. Meaning did not require movement. In fact, familiarity intensified everything. When you knew every face in town, every disagreement mattered more. When you expected to see the same people for the rest of your life, grudges lasted longer, and forgiveness carried greater weight. Marriage was not just between 2 people, it was between families who would remain intertwined for generations. Leaving town meant severing those threads. That was not a decision taken lightly. As newspapers expanded in the mid-1800s, they became windows into distant worlds. A farmer in Ohio might read about floods in Louisiana or revolutions in Europe. But these events felt abstract. Interesting, yes. Urgent? No. Without photographs, radio, or film, the outside world existed mostly in imagination, and imagination rarely overpowered obligation. Still, change pressed forward. The telegraph arrived like lightning captured in wire. Messages that once took weeks could now travel in minutes. News moved faster than people. Ironically, this made many feel less need to travel. Why go somewhere if information could come to you? A merchant could learn prices in New York without leaving his shop. A politician could receive updates from Washington without boarding a stagecoach. Knowledge became mobile before bodies did. But the human urge to move, slowly, quietly, grew stronger. Young people especially felt it. A son who had grown up plowing the same field year after year might hear stories of Chicago's booming streets or San Francisco's gold-lit hills. A daughter might dream of a city where her future was not already written. Yet dreams had limits. Money was scarce, opportunities uncertain, failure unforgiving. And so, most stayed. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage often looked like endurance. By the late 1800s, America began telling itself a new story, one of movement, of westward expansion, of opportunity waiting just beyond the horizon. This story was not entirely false, but it was incomplete. It celebrated those who left. It forgot those who stayed. The millions who never crossed state lines, who lived and died within sight of the same trees, who built the quiet infrastructure of everyday life. Their contribution did not leave monuments, but it held the nation together. Even today, traces of their world remain. In rural towns where families share the same last names as they did 2 centuries ago. In cemeteries where generations lie side by side, dates overlapping like echoes. In old roads that curve not for efficiency, but because someone once needed to avoid a stream, a hill, or a neighbor's land. These are the fingerprints of people who did not travel far. And if we listen carefully, really listen, we can still hear them. In the creak of old floorboards, in the names of places no longer on maps, in the stubborn persistence of communities that refuse to disappear. Modern Americans travel thousands of miles without a second thought. We cross states in hours, countries in days, continents in
the bell notification icon